If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description. Welcome to MINDSHOCK. This is your host, Bruce McGuire, and you are listening to the long-awaited JFK podcast. Some refer to the JFK assassination as the mother of all conspiracy theories. It is what started it all in the government being questioned en masse, in having shady dealings in any capacity. Whereas before the JFK assassination, there was a certain blind faith and trust in the government. Corruption was kind of looked at as something extremely rare and not really worthy of discussion, even though it was rampant and obvious back then as well. But just in terms of general sentiment, the JFK assassination, the Warren Commission report, and the debunking of, or the criticism of the report is actually what led to the CIA conjuring up detailed directives to all agency bureaus. It was titled Countering Criticism of the Warren Commission Report. And this is where they kind of weaponized the term conspiracy theory and conspiracy theorists to try to discredit anyone using logic, objectivity, critical thinking, reason of any kind, and not just taking on blind faith what corrupt profiteers in the government are putting on the idiot box and publishing. Everything should be taken on blind faith, nothing questioned. So that's why the term conspiracy theory was invented by the CIA. And obviously there were other events. We have the Roswell incident, 1947, other UFO incidents, and various other events throughout history, Gulf of Tonkin. There's a lot of things, but JFK is kind of the big one. And it has been requested so many times on MindShock. I will finally be tackling it in typical MindShock fashion, of course, with logic and reason at the forefront, attempting not to fall for any logical fallacies, which it seems every documentary or podcast out there falls for logical fallacies in promoting their specific theory of what happened in the JFK assassination. And I'll be taking a look at all theories, including links to UFOs, links to the Men in Black, Illuminati links, and even links to Admiral Byrd and Antarctica, believe it or not. There's a lot of theories out there. The coincidence theorists will have a field day as well, because there's plenty of people in attendance of the JFK assassination. I mean, even actors like Bill Paxton, as a child, was there. And the people involved in these reports and trials, it's an endless list of coincidences. That'll raise an eyebrow of anybody that's capable of critical thought. As always, if you enjoy the MindShock podcast, you find it interesting, educational, and entertaining, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. Like and share this podcast on social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. You can find us on there as well. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast, or requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. So, this is episode 1, the mother of all conspiracies. We will be examining the official narratives, whether or not they hold up, why people continue to believe in this magic bullet nonsense, and furthermore, just it's very curious because it's very easy to see. Again, only if you have basic, I mean, you don't even need that advanced logic or reason, just basic common sense. If you're accusing an entity, in this case the government, of killing JFK or somebody, the government commissions a government report clearing the government of all suspicion. That settles that, right? I mean, the coincidence theorists and the cognitive dissonant masses, they just bought it. As if an entity investigating itself, if it was its conflict of interest, this is a topic children can grasp. This is a concept that's not that advanced. Entities who have something to lose would not incriminate themselves. I mean, it's just really bizarre how people watching the Idiot Box, they just blindly believe it. Oh, well, if there was some kind of complicity, they would have admitted it or found it. Really? Why? I mean, that goes against basic human nature, basic psychology, all of human history. I mean, it's really, really bizarre. But let's examine the official narrative first, and then we will examine all the theories, all the anomalies. And there's been some really curious new information that has come out in even just the past 5 years that has supposedly never been known before. Some mind-shocking information. And obviously in 2017, there were a lot of CIA files declassified regarding the JFK assassination. I don't know what the number was, somewhere around 97% of the files. So there's still a certain, and that's again if you're trusting their numbers, but even according to their numbers, that's still 3% of the files are still classified. So John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th president of the United States, was assassinated on Friday, November 22nd, 1963 at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time in Dallas, Texas, while riding in a presidential motorcade through Dealey Plaza. Kennedy was riding with his wife Jacqueline, Texas Governor John Connally, and Connally's wife Nellie when he was fatally shot by former U.S. Marine Lee Harvey Oswald, firing in ambush from a nearby building. I mean, allegedly, right? Allegedly fatally shot. I mean, I'm going to drop a mind shock right here. There's a photograph that shows Lee Harvey Oswald in a doorway at the moment that JFK is being shot. So how could he be operating a weapon, firing the shot when he's standing in a doorway unarmed watching the motorcade? I mean, we might as well start off with the mind shocks right away. So, of course, like with anything, there are dissenting opinions in every direction. But let's look at the website mcadams.posc.mu.edu. Was Oswald in the doorway of the depository at the time of the JFK assassination? By Megan Knuth. For a brief while, it looked like an airtight alibi for Oswald. Just a few seconds after the first shot at President Kennedy was fired, James Altkins of the Associated Press snapped a photograph of the president on Elm Street with the Texas School Book Depository in the background. The photo shows a man who looks uncannily similar to Oswald standing in the doorway. The New York Herald Tribune on May 24th, 1964, publicized the claim of researcher Jones Harris that the man was indeed Oswald. The Herald Tribune was not some supermarket tabloid, but rather a widely respected newspaper. Further, the Oswald figure had been noticed and investigated even before the article appeared. So the commission devoted considerable attention to the claim. They quickly identified Billy Nolan Lovelady as the man in the doorway and questioned several people about the whereabouts of themselves and Lovelady as the motorcade passed. William Shelley, Sarah Stanton, Wesley Frazier, Billy Lovelady, and Danny Arce all testified and or signed an affidavit stating Lovelady was standing outside the depository doors as the motorcade passed. Harold Norman and James Jarman Jr. testified they saw Lovelady in the doorway minutes before the motorcade passed, and they left to watch from the 5th floor of the depository. Frazier, Arce, and Mrs. Donald Baker all identified Lovelady as the Oswald lookalike in the photograph. Lovelady, of course, identified himself. Frazier states that he does not see himself in the photo because he was further back than Lovelady and thus in the black area of the photograph. The other people with whom Lovelady was standing, Shelley and Stanton, were also farther back than him and so are also not shown in the picture. This is why Lovelady appears to be standing alone. On the basis of all this evidence, the commission concluded that the man was Lovelady, not Oswald. This should have settled the issue forever, but alas, in this case, issues are rarely ever settled. The issue was revived not due to some research done by conspiracists, but rather because of an FBI mistake. And just a quick note here, just because people are if there was a conspiracy, if it was Oswald and there was some mess up in the timing of framing the patsy, how easy would it be for the CIA or the FBI or other government agencies to pay off and or intimidate these 3 people that saw? I mean, they could intimidate a lot more than 3 people to sign affidavits. I mean, so I don't know why the claim that the issue should have been settled. I don't know. It's really bizarre. Continuing on here, in a report to the Warren Commission on the Man in the Doorway, the FBI stated, on February 29, 1964, Billy Nolan Lovelady was photographed by special agents of the FBI at Dallas, Texas. On this occasion, Lovelady advised that on the day of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963, at the time of the assassination and shortly before, he was standing in the doorway of the front entrance to the depository where he is employed. He stated he was wearing a red and white vertical striped shirt and blue jeans. The FBI photos show Lovelady in a red and white vertical striped short-sleeved shirt, but the man in the doorway is clearly wearing a long-sleeved checkered shirt. The commission never double-checked the 2 photographs, but simply believed Lovelady when he told the FBI he was in the doorway. The FBI reported, along with the photographs of Lovelady, only fed the controversy. And again, if the commission is taking all these things on blind faith, how valid of a commission is it? Again, the words of humans do not necessarily represent reality. And we'll be examining other evidence here, but let's continue just with this mind-shocking aside. The controversy shouldn't have lasted for long. In 1967, Josiah Thompson published the best-selling book 6 Seconds in Dallas. He discussed the controversy over the man in the doorway and took note of the Warren Commission testimony and the FBI report. On the issue of why Lovelady was photographed by the FBI on February 29, 1964, wearing a red and white vertical striped shirt with short sleeves, while the man in the doorway was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, Thompson noted that Lovelady told CBS News, "Well, when the FBI took me in the shirt, I told them it wasn't the same shirt." Thompson added that the shirt Lovelady now claims to have worn on November 22nd is long-sleeved and patterned in large squares. At that point, the issue should have been solved. Why? If there's all this conflicting information, I mean, it's kind of weird. But in typical fashion, conspiracy authors simply ignored inconvenient evidence, or simply didn't take on blind faith as gospel from the accused. Gary Shaw, in his 1976 book, Cover Up, claimed that the question of who was in the doorway had not been adequately answered. He wrote, "We believe the identity of the man in the doorway is still open to question. There is as much, if not more, evidence to indicate that the accused assassin was exactly where he said he was, on the first floor of the depository." Shaw also claimed that no one on the commission ever saw Lovelady, and there is no published photo of Lovelady in the commission's exhibits or documents. So again, if he was mistaken about something, then everything is shot. If the FBI or CIA are mistaken about something, it's all good. It was just a simple mistake. You gotta love the authority-worshipping cultists who just blindly believe whatever government says all the time. Also, in the 1970s, the LA Free Press and Argosy published the claim using blown-up photos to show the resemblance. The House Select Committee on Assassinations felt that this issue needed more investigation. They took a 2-pronged approach. The House Select Committee on Assassinations first had its photographic evidence panel examine 203 and 369 photos of Oswald and of Lovelady. They used the tools of forensic anthropology by which the metric and morphological characteristics of the human face can be analyzed, going far beyond the causal and subjective looks-like kind of analysis. They used the Penrose distance statistic to show that the man in the doorway had features very different from Oswald. And again, you need to have objective commissions. I don't know why this is such a difficult concept for coincidence theorists to understand. But another point, if they knew it really was Lovelady and they wanted to make the farce that these committees and commissions were actually legitimate, they would scrutinize and do all this work on certain aspects of this assassination that they knew were false to make it look like they appear legit and completely ignore other lines of inquiry. Based on the analysis of the photographic evidence panel, the committee concluded that it was highly improbable that the man in the doorway was Oswald and highly probable that he was Lovelady. And this was in their report, page 58. The other approach was that of Robert Groden, who had a good knowledge of all the photographic evidence in the case. Groden analyzed 3 films, the John Martin film, the Robert Hughes film, and the Mark Bell film. These films showed a man in the doorway wearing a shirt identical in appearance to the shirt on the man in the Altkins photo. But these films show that the man wasn't Oswald, but rather was Lovelady. Indeed, Groden contacted Lovelady, asked him to don the shirt he had worn on November 22nd, 1963, and photographed him in it. The shirt, of course, was entirely consistent with all the photos of the day of the assassination. Groden, a man responsible for many silly conspiracy factoids, had in fact scored a solid research coup. Again, using this term silly conspiracy to try to shut down logical lines of inquiry. As of today, most conspiracy theorists will admit that the man in the doorway was Billy Lovelady. Even Jim Marrs states in his book Crossfire that most researchers today are ready to concede that the man may have been Lovelady. May have been. Yet, some conspiracy theorists still cling to this factoid. The website of Best of Kennedy Assassination Links show that the picture of Oswald in the doorway next to a photo of Oswald and asserts the man in the doorway was in fact Lee Harvey Oswald. So again, you have these appeals to extremes where you have people concluding it wasn't, people concluding it was, when the real truth's a little murkier because it's not exactly like this footage is high def. It's kind of hard to tell. And if there were only 3 affidavits signed, that's not a lot. I mean, just on the surface. Professor James Fetzer's edited book, Murder in Dealey Plaza, claims the following. A man many people think strongly resembles Lee Harvey Oswald is pictured standing in the front entrance of the book depository building. If it is in fact Oswald, he could not have been on the 6th floor of the building when the shots were fired. The Warren Commission will discount any possibility that the figure is Oswald and instead identifies the man as Billy Nolan Lovelady, another building employee. The man in the photo is wearing a dark, heavy textured shirt, open halfway to the waist over a white undershirt. Lovelady later tells reporters he was wearing a red and white striped sports shirt that day. The identity of the man in the photo has never been clearly established. The most bizarre thing about all this is Oswald himself admitted to being inside the building. He told the officers who interrogated him that he was in the first floor lunchroom, eating his lunch at the time of the shooting. Then there is a following exchange with reporters in the hallway of the Dallas Police Department. Did you shoot the president? Oswald said, I work in that building. That's not exactly answering the question. Were you in the building at the time? Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir. Thus, we have a conspiracist claiming an alibi for Oswald that flatly contradicts his own statements. He didn't necessarily... In the hallway can technically be in the building. So, again, obviously this website is highly biased coincidence theory and firmly in the camp of the authority-worshipping cult, where they don't find anything strange about government agencies investigating themselves in their own complicity in possible situations. Now, obviously, it could have been Lovelady, but to say that this was a 100% conclusively proven, it's kind of difficult. It seems like it very well could have been Lovelady, because there's other footage that shows him from the side, and he looks a bit different. There also appears to be some inconsistency with even, I don't know, in the recreated photos of the FBI, they didn't even do the buttons right. I mean, I don't know. The whole thing is kind of weird, but again, just to show the level of conspiracy that's theorized and the methodology employed by these commissions in appearing to be legitimate. But anyway, that all stemmed from, again, in the Wikipedia here, we're just going through the basic, the official narrative, which states that Lee Harvey Oswald firing an ambush from a nearby building. Governor Connolly was seriously wounded in the attack. The motorcade rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where Kennedy was pronounced dead about 30 minutes after the shooting. Connolly recovered. Oswald was arrested by the Dallas Police Department 70 minutes after the initial shooting. Oswald was charged under Texas state law with the murder of Kennedy, as well as that of Dallas policeman J.D. Tippit, who had been fatally shot a short time after the assassination. At 11:21 a.m., November 24, 1963, as live television cameras were covering his transfer from the city jail to the county jail, Oswald was fatally shot in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters, then in the Dallas Municipal Building, by Dallas nightclub operator Jack Ruby. Oswald was taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he soon died. Ruby was convicted of Oswald's murder, although it was later overturned on appeal, and Ruby died in prison in 1967 while awaiting a new trial. And of course, there are a ton of links between Oswald, Ruby, the CIA, even the Russians. I mean, there's so much insanity in this case that coincidence theorists just brush off, where it's very obvious there's something weird going on with all of these individuals. Now, exactly what that is, that remains, some would argue that it's not definitively proven, and there's plenty to explore there. After a 10-month investigation, the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald assassinated Kennedy, that Oswald had acted entirely alone, and that Ruby had acted alone in killing Oswald. A lone gunman killed by a lone gunman. Kennedy was the 8th and most recent U.S. president to die in office, and the 4th following Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley to be assassinated. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson automatically became president upon Kennedy's death, and there's a lot of convenient issues regarding Johnson, and there's connections to the Bush family, which we will all be exploring. A later investigation, the United States House Select Committee on Assassinations agreed with the Warren Commission, what a shocker, that the injuries that Kennedy and Connally sustained were caused by Oswald's 3 rifle shots, but they also concluded that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. They used the word conspiracy. Wow! As analysis of a dictabelt audio recording pointed to the existence of an additional gunshot, and therefore a high probability that 2 gunmen fired at the president. The committee was not able to identify any individuals or groups involved with the possible conspiracy. In addition, the HSCA found that the original federal investigations were seriously flawed with respect to information sharing and the possibility of conspiracy. As recommended by the HSCA, the dictabelt evidence suggesting conspiracy was subsequently re-examined and rejected. It was determined that the dictabelt recorded sounds at another location in Dallas about 1 minute after Kennedy had been shot. And if they were legitimate and they wanted to put the kibosh on this, is that the way they would do it? Oh, they were actually recording something else. Let's just conveniently explain it away ad hoc. In light of the investigative reports determining that reliable acoustic data do not support a conclusion that there was a second gunman, the U.S. Justice Department concluded active investigations and stated that, quote, that no persuasive evidence can be identified to support the theory of a conspiracy, end quote, in the assassination. However, Kennedy's assassination is still the subject of widespread debate and has spawned numerous conspiracy theories and alternative scenarios. Polls conducted from 1966 to 2004 found that up to 80% of Americans suspected that there was a plot or a cover-up, which is kind of strange, because, and you see this all the time with coincidence theorists, scientism cultists, the Dunning-Kruger cognitive dissonant masses, where they'll believe one thing, but they'll believe the government is capable of one conspiracy, but clearly not capable of others. It's really, really bizarre. But like I said, the JFK is, by some, considered the mother of all conspiracy theories. So let's look at the timeline here. Background: Kennedy chose to travel to Texas to smooth over frictions in the Democratic Party between liberals Ralph Yarborough and Don Yarborough. No relation. Another coincidence. You have the president traveling to Texas to smooth over frictions between 2 guys with the same last name, which is not that popular of a last name. How many Yarboroughs do you know? Personally, I don't think I've ever known any Yarboroughs. Possibly one, I'm not sure how they spelled it, or something similar to that. But what are the chances that there's 2 unrelated Yarboroughs who the president is specifically going to see? Okay. And conservative Texas Governor John Connally. The visit was first agreed upon by Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, a Texas native, and Connally during a meeting in El Paso in June. Kennedy later decided to embark on the trip with 3 basic goals in mind. 1, to help raise more Democratic Party presidential campaign fund contributions. 2, begin his quest for re-election in November '64. and 3, to help make political amends during several leading Texas Democratic Party members who appeared to be fighting politically amongst themselves since the Kennedy-Johnson ticket had barely won Texas in 1960 and had even lost in Dallas. The trip was publicly announced in September 1963. The exact motorcade route was finalized on November 18th and publicly announced a few days before November 22nd. Route to Dealey Plaza, Kennedy's itinerary called for him to arrive at Dallas Love Field via a short flight from Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth. The motorcade route through Dallas, with Kennedy, Connally, and their wives together in a single limousine and Johnson and his wife 2 cars behind, was intended to give Kennedy maximum exposure to local crowds before his arrival, for a luncheon at the Trade Mart where he would meet with civic and business leaders. The Dallas Trade Mart was preliminarily selected as the site for the luncheon, and Kenneth O'Donnell, Kennedy's friend and appointments secretary, had selected it as the final destination on the motorcade route. Leaving from Dallas Love Field, the motorcade had been allotted 45 minutes to reach the Trade Mart at a planned arrival time of 12:15 p.m. The itinerary was designed to serve as a meandering 10-mile route between the two places, and the motorcade vehicles could be driven slowly with the allotted time. Special Agent Winston G. Lawson, a member of the White House detail who acted as the advance Secret Service agent, and Secret Service agent Forrest V. Sorrells, special agent in charge of the Dallas office, were the most active in planning the actual motorcade route. On November 14th, both men attended a meeting at Love Field and drove over the route that Sorrells believed was best suited for the motorcade. From Love Field, the route passed through a suburban section of Dallas, through downtown along Main Street, a right turn on North Houston Street for 1 block, a left turn on Elm Street, passing through Dealey Plaza, and finally to the Trade Mart via a short segment of the Stemmons Freeway. Kennedy had planned to return to Love Field to depart for a fundraising dinner in Austin later that day. For the return trip, the agents selected a more direct route, which was approximately 4 miles. Some of this route would be used after the assassination. The planned route to the Trade Mart was widely reported in Dallas newspapers several days before the event for the benefit of people who wished to view the motorcade. To pass directly through downtown Dallas, a route west along Main Street rather than Elm Street, 1 block to the north, was chosen since this was the traditional parade route and provided the maximal building and crowd views. The Main Street section of the route precluded a direct turn onto the Fort Worth Turnpike exit, which served also as the Stemmons Freeway exit, which was the route to the Trade Mart, as this exit was only accessible from Elm Street. Therefore, the planned motorcade route included a short 1-block turn at the end of the downtown segment of Main Street onto Houston Street for 1 block northward, before turning again west onto Elm. That way they could proceed through Dealey Plaza before exiting Elm to the Stemmons Freeway. The Texas School Book Depository was, and still is, situated at the northwest corner of the Houston and Elm Street intersection. 3 vehicles were used for Secret Service and police protection in the Dallas motorcade. The first car, an unmarked white Ford hardtop, carried Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry, Secret Service Agent Win Lawson, Sheriff Bill Decker, and Dallas Field Agent Forrest Sorrells. The second car, a 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible, was occupied by driver Agent Bill Greer, SAIC Roy Kellerman, Governor John Connally, Nellie Connally, President Kennedy, and Jackie Kennedy. The third car, a 1955 Cadillac convertible codenamed Halfback, contains driver Agent Sam Kinney, ATSAIC Emery Roberts, presidential aides Ken O'Donnell and Dave Powers, driver Agent George Hickey, and PRS Agent Glenn Bennett. Secret Service agents Clint Hill, Jack Reddy, Tim McIntyre, and Paul Landis rode on the running boards. On November 22nd, after a breakfast speech in Fort Worth, where Kennedy had stayed overnight after arriving from San Antonio, Houston, and D.C. the previous day, Kennedy boarded Air Force One, which departed at 11:10, and arrived at Love Field 15 minutes later. At about 11:40, Kennedy's motorcade left Love Field for the trip through Dallas, running on a schedule about 10 minutes longer than the planned 45 due to enthusiastic crowds. estimated at 150,000 to 200,000 people, and 2 unplanned stops directed by Kennedy. The assassination, shooting in Dealey Plaza. So looking at Dealey Plaza here, Main and Elm Streets in Dealey Plaza, the white concrete pergola where Abraham Zapruder filmed what turned out to be the assassination of U.S. President John F. Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963, is on the right side of the scene. The grassy knoll is to the left of it. Kennedy was struck by the final bullet at a position just to the photo left of the lamp post in front of the pergola. The triple underpass is in this photo center. The red brick building, partially visible at the upper right, is the Texas School Book Depository. Okay, Kennedy was struck by the final bullet when he was just left of the lamppost in front of the pergola. Kennedy's open-top 1961 Lincoln Continental four-door convertible limousine entered Dealey Plaza at 12:30 p.m. Nellie Connolly, the First Lady of Texas, turned to Kennedy, who was sitting behind her, and commented, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Kennedy's reply, "No, you certainly can't," were his last words. Or allegedly. There are even conspiracy theories that Kennedy somehow survived. And we'll be getting into those as well. From Houston Street, the limousine made the planned left turn onto Elm to provide access to the Stemmons Freeway exit. As it turned, it passed by the Texas School Book Depository, where it continued down Elm Street. Shots were fired. About 80% of the witnesses recalled hearing 3 shots. A Mannlicher Carcano rifle and 3 shell casings were also found near an open window on the book depository's 6th floor. Found or planted, we don't know. A small number of witnesses recognized the first gunshot shortly after Kennedy began waving for what it was, but there was little reaction from most in the crowd or riding the motorcade. Many later said they imagined what they heard to be a firecracker or a vehicle backfiring, although some close witnesses recalled seeing the limousine slow down, nearly stop, or completely stop. The Warren Commission, based on the Zapruder film, found that the limousine had traveled an average speed of 11.2 miles per hour over the 186 feet of Elm Street immediately preceding the fatal headshot. And of course, the Zapruder film itself, there's a lot of controversy and conspiracy surrounding that as well, that it was edited. And we'll be going over what was in the film before and after the edit. Texas School Book Depository employee Bonnie Ray Williams testified that he recognized Oswald as someone whom he saw on the 6th floor twice before the assassination took place. Within 1 second of each other, Governor Connolly and Mrs. Kennedy turn abruptly from looking to their left to looking to their right, beginning of Zapruder film frame 162. Connolly, like Kennedy, was a World War II military veteran and was a longtime hunter. He testified that he immediately recognized the sound as that of a high-powered rifle and turned his head and torso rightward in an attempt to see Kennedy behind him. He testified he could not see Kennedy, so he then started to turn forward again, turning from his right to his left, and that when his head was facing about 20 degrees left of center, he was hit in his upper right back by a bullet that he did not hear fired. The doctor who operated on Connolly estimated that his head at the time he was hit had been 27 degrees left of center. After Connolly was hit, he shouted, "Oh, no, no, no. My God, they're going to kill us all." Mrs. Connolly testified that just after hearing a loud, frightening noise that came from somewhere behind her and to her right, she turned toward Kennedy and saw him raise up his arms and elbows with his hands in front of his face and throat. She then heard another shot and then Governor Connolly yelling. Mrs. Connolly then turned away from Kennedy toward her husband, at which point another gunshot sounded, and both she and the limousine's rear interior were covered with fragments of skull, blood, and brain. According to the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Kennedy was waving to the crowds on his right with his right arm upraised on the side of the limo when a shot entered his upper back, penetrated his neck, and slightly damaged a spinal vertebrae and the top of his right lung. The bullet exited his throat nearly centerline, just beneath his larynx, and nicked the left side of his suit tie knot. He raised his elbows and clenched his fists in front of his face and neck, then leaned forward and left. Mrs. Kennedy, facing him, then put her arms around him in concern. According to the Warren Commission's single bullet theory, Governor Connally also reacted after the same bullet penetrated his back just below his right armpit. The bullet created an oval-shaped entry wound, impacted and destroyed 4 inches of his right fifth rib, and exited his chest just below his right nipple. This created a 2.5-inch oval-shaped air-sucking chest wound. The same bullet then entered his arm just above his right wrist and cleanly shattered his right radius bone into 8 pieces. The bullet exited just below the wrist at the inner side of his right palm and finally lodged in his left inner thigh. The Warren Commission theorized that the single bullet struck sometime between Zapruder frames 210 and 225, while the House Select Committee theorized that it struck at approximately Zapruder frame 190. So these commissions and committees can't even agree on what's going on with this magic bullet. According to the Warren Commission, a second shot that struck Kennedy was recorded at Zapruder film frame 313. The commission made no conclusion as to whether this was the second or third bullet fired. The limousine then passed in front of the John Neely Bryan North Pergola concrete structure. The 2 investigative committees concluded that the second shot to hit Kennedy entered the rear of his head. The House Select Committee placed the entry wound 4 inches higher than the Warren Commission placed it. 4 inches is kind of a lot. Are there no autopsies? And we'll have to get into all the shady autopsy issues. Disappearing bodies, falsified reports, all that fun stuff. And passed in fragments through his skull. This created a large, roughly ovular hole on the rear right side of the head. Kennedy's blood and fragments of his scalp, brain, and skull landed on the interior of the car, the inner and outer surfaces of the front glass windshield, the raised sun visors, the front engine hood, and the rear trunk lid. His blood and fragments also landed on the Secret Service follow-up car and its driver's left arm, as well on the motorcycle officers who were riding on both sides of Kennedy just behind his vehicle. Secret Service agent Clint Hill was riding on the left front running board of the follow-up car, which was immediately behind Kennedy's limousine. Hill testified that he heard 1 shot. Then, as documented in other films and concurrent with Zapruder frame 308, he jumped off into Elm Street and ran forward to board the trunk of the limousine and protect Kennedy. Hill testified to the Warren Commission that he heard the fatal headshot as he was reaching the limousine approximately 5 seconds after the first shot that he heard. After Kennedy was shot in the head, Mrs. Kennedy began climbing out onto the back of the limousine, though she later had no recollection of doing so. She believed she was reaching for something, perhaps a piece of Kennedy's skull. He jumped into the back of the limousine while at the same time Mrs. Kennedy returned to her seat, and he clung to the car as it exited Dealey Plaza and accelerated, speeding to Parkland Memorial Hospital. After Mrs. Kennedy crawled back into her limousine seat, both Governor and Mrs. Connally heard her repeatedly say, "They have killed my husband. I have his brains in my hand." Mrs. Kennedy recalled, "All the ride to the hospital, I kept bending over him saying, 'Jack, Jack, can you hear me? I love you, Jack.' I kept holding the top of his head down, trying to keep the brains in." Quite traumatic, of course. Governor Connally and a spectator wounded. Governor Connally was seated directly in front of Kennedy and 3 inches more to the left than Kennedy. He was also seriously injured but survived. Doctors later stated that after the governor was shot, his wife pulled him onto her lap, and the resulting pressure helped close his front chest wound, which was causing air to be sucked directly into his chest around his collapsed right lung. Bystander James Tague received a minor wound to the right cheek while standing 531 feet away from the depository's sixth floor easternmost window, 270 feet in front of and slightly to the right of Kennedy's head, facing direction and more than 16 feet below the top of Kennedy's head. Tague's injury occurred when a bullet or bullet fragment with no copper casing struck the nearby Main Street South curb. A deputy sheriff noticed some blood on Tague's cheek, and Tague realized that something had stung his face during the shooting. When Tague pointed to where he had been standing, the police officer noted a bullet smear on a nearby curb. 9 months later, the FBI removed the curb, and a spectrographic analysis revealed metallic residue consistent with that of the lead core in Oswald ammunition. Tague testified before the Warren Commission and initially stated that he was wounded on his cheek by either the second or third shots of the 3 shots he remembered hearing. When the Commission counsel pressed him to be more specific, Tague testified that he was wounded by the second shot. Okay, and you know what else is interesting is, and I'll be getting into this more specifics, but I mean, other than, of course, the people that said the shot came from the front, the grassy knoll, evidence of such, but there was another witness, Pierce Allman. He was the program director at WFAA Radio in 1963. He witnessed the assassination from the corner of Houston and Elm. He was one of the first reporters inside the Texas School Book Depository, where he is believed to have encountered Lee Harvey Oswald leaving the building. And what's interesting is that Pierce Allman states that there was no interval. Without any interval, boom, a third shot. So someone is shooting at a vehicle, even if it's only moving at 11 miles per hour, it's still a moving vehicle. And even if it wasn't moving, it's still kind of tough. But he's shooting someone in the head of a moving vehicle from the 6th floor. Now, the problem is the Carcano is a bolt-action rifle. So to fire off these shots, and from the second to the third without any interval as described by the witness, it's how can you do that in less than a second to continue with a moving with a moving target? It's kind of bizarre. This is less than a second. And so Connolly also agrees that there were 3 shots and there was no interval between the second and third shot. Now, what does that mean? Obviously, there's a lot of issues. We'll be examining that and plenty more. And that was from the LA Times interview of Pierce Allman. It was actually posted to YouTube November 22nd, 2013, regarding there not being an interval between the second and third shots. But continuing here, aftermath in Dealey Plaza. The limousine was passing the grassy knoll to the north of Elm Street at the time of the fatal shot. As the motorcade left Dealey Plaza, police officers and spectators ran up the grassy hill and from the triple underpass to the area behind a 5-foot-high stockade fence atop the knoll, separating it from the parking lot. No sniper was found there. S.M. Holland, who had been watching the motorcade on the triple underpass, testified that immediately after the shots were fired, he saw a puff of smoke rising from the trees right by the stockade fence and then ran around the corner where the overpass joined the fence, but did not see anyone running from that area. Lee Bowers was in a 2-story railroad switch tower, which gave him an unobstructed view of the rear of the stockade fence atop the grassy knoll. He saw 4 men in the area between his tower and Elm Street. 2 men who seemed not to know each other near the triple underpass, some 10 to 15 feet apart, and 1 or 2 uniformed parking lot attendants. At the time of the shooting, he saw, quote, something out of the ordinary, a sort of milling around, end quote, which he could not identify. Bowers testified that 1 or both of the men were still there when motorcycle officer Clyde Haygood ran up the grassy knoll to the back of the fence. In a 1966 interview, Bowers clarified that the two men he saw were standing in the opening between the pergola and the fence and that no one was behind the fence at the time the shots were fired. And who got to these people between earlier statements and later statements for so-called clarification? Because if there was a conspiracy, obviously many conspiracies involved intimidation, coercion, and altered statements. This is nothing new. Meanwhile, Howard Brennan, a steam fitter who had been sitting across the street from the Texas School Book Depository, approached police to say that as the motorcade passed, he heard a shot come from above him, then looked up to see a man with a rifle take another shot from a sixth floor corner window. He said he had seen the same man looking out the window minutes earlier. Police broadcast Brennan's description of this man at 12:45, 12:48, and 12:55 p.m. After the second shot, Brennan recalled this man was aiming for his last shot and maybe paused for another second as though to assure himself that he had hit his mark. And again, we have all these conflicting testimonies saying there's no pause, then this guy saying there's a pause. As Brennan spoke to the police in front of the building, they were joined by two book depository employees who had been watching the motorcade from windows at the southeast corner of the building's fifth floor. One reported hearing 3 gunshots coming from directly over their heads, the sounds of a bolt-action rifle and cartridges dropping on the floor above. Dallas police sealed off the exits from the depository approximately between 12:33 and 12:50 p.m. There were at least 104 ear witnesses in Dealey Plaza who were on record with an opinion as to the direction from which the shots came. 54 witnesses, that comprises 51.9%, thought that all shots came from the depository. 33, which comprised 31.7%, thought that they came from either the grassy knoll or the triple underpass. 9, which comprised 8.7%, thought that each shot came from a location entirely distinct from the knoll or the depository. 5, comprising 4.8%, believed that they heard shots from 2 locations, and 3, comprising 2.9%, thought that the shots originated from a direction consistent with both the knoll and the depository. So that is really interesting. So only 3 of the 104 official ear witnesses on record stated that they thought the shots came from both the knoll and the depository. Only 3 witnesses thought that. 5 witnesses, I guess, believe they heard shots from 2 locations, but I guess they couldn't specify which. So that would be 8 total believed in 2. 8 believed it came from, well, actually, we can't really say that. 9 thought that each shot came from a location entirely distinct from the knoll or the depository. So 9 do not believe it came from the knoll or depository. 5 believe there are 2 locations, 3 of which believed, and 3 believed that they came from just the knoll and depository. So you could group them in, but that's still, so basically half of the witnesses, that's a decent number, but that would point to at least some of the shots coming from the depository. Because that's a lot of people to be mistaken. 33 thought, I'm guessing it's stating here all shots. 33 said that all shots came from the grassy knoll or the triple underpass, which comprised 31.7%. That's not a small number. 33 out of 104. That's a decent chunk. That's not like 9 or 5 or 3. But yeah, but again, with the shock and awe and this just this very busy intersection. I mean, this is a police motorcade. It's not like it's an isolated location where people were clearly looking out for things and can clearly remember everything. So we have to keep that in mind as well. The Warren Commission additionally concluded that 3 shots were fired and said that quote, a substantial majority of the witnesses stated that the shots were not evenly spaced. Most witnesses recalled that the second and third shots were bunched together. So this again conflicts with Howard Brennan's testimony that there was a pause between the last shot. Okay. Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. Depository employee Buell Wesley Frazier, who drove Oswald to work, testified that he saw Oswald take a long brown paper bag into the building, which Oswald told him were curtain rods. After Oswald's supervisor at the depository reported him missing, police broadcast his description as a suspect in the shooting at Dealey Plaza. Police officer J.D. Tippett subsequently spotted Oswald walking along a sidewalk in the residential neighborhood of Oak Cliff, 3 miles from Dealey Plaza, and called him over to the patrol car. After an exchange of words, Tippett got out of his car. Oswald shot Tippett 4 times, emptied the bullet casings from his gun, and fled. The long brown bag, which Frazier described, was also found by 6 Dallas police officers near the 6th floor window, where Oswald was determined to have fired gunshots at President Kennedy, and was revealed to be 38 inches long with marks on the inside consistent with those of a rifle. And of course, if there is a cover-up, obviously they would have planted shell casings and such. Oswald was subsequently seen ducking into the entrance alcove of a store by the store's manager, who then watched Oswald continue up the street and slip into the Texas Theater without paying. The store manager alerted the theater's ticket clerk, who telephoned police. At about 1:40 p.m., officers arrived and arrested Oswald inside the theater. According to one of the officers, Oswald resisted and was attempting to draw his pistol when he was struck and restrained. Oswald was charged with the murders of Kennedy and Tippett later that night. He denied shooting anyone and claimed he was made a patsy because he had lived in the Soviet Union. On Sunday, November 24th at 11:21 a.m., as Oswald was being escorted to a car in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters for the transfer from the city jail to the county jail, he was fatally shot by Dallas nightclub owner Jack Ruby. The shooting was broadcast live on American television. Unconscious, Oswald was taken by ambulance to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. He died at 1:07 p.m. Oswald's death was announced on a TV news broadcast by Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry. An autopsy later that day by Dallas County Medical Examiner Earl Rose found that Oswald had been killed by a gunshot wound to the chest. Arrested immediately after the shooting, Ruby said that he had been distraught by Kennedy's death and that killing Oswald would spare Mrs. Kennedy the discomfiture of coming back to trial. Interesting. The Carcano rifle. An Italian Carcano M91 38 bolt-action rifle was found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository by Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman and Deputy Sheriff Eugene Boone soon after the assassination. The recovery was filmed by Tom Allier of WFAA TV. This footage shows the rifle to be a Carcano, and photographic analysis commissioned by the HSCA verified that the rifle filmed was the one later identified as the assassination weapon. Compared to photographs taken of Oswald holding the rifle in his backyard, one notch in the stock at a point that appears very faintly in the photograph matched as well as the rifle's dimensions. The rifle had been purchased secondhand by Oswald the previous March under the alias A. Hiddle and delivered to a post office box he had rented in Dallas. According to the Warren report, a partial palm print belonging to Oswald was also found on the barrel, and fibers found in a crevice of the rifle were consistent with the fibers from the shirt Oswald was wearing when he was arrested. A bullet found on Governor Connolly's hospital gurney and 2 bullet fragments found in the limousine were ballistically matched to this rifle. Kennedy declared dead in the emergency room. In a death certificate executed the following day, Kennedy's personal physician, George Berkeley, recited that he had arrived at the hospital some 5 minutes after Kennedy, and though Secret Service personnel reported that Kennedy had been breathing, immediately saw that survival was impossible. The certificate listed gunshot wound skull as the cause of death. Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. after heart activity ceased. Father Oscar Huber administered the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church. Huber told the New York Times that by the time he arrived at the hospital, Kennedy had died, so that he had to draw back a sheet covering Kennedy's face to administer the sacrament of extreme unction. Kennedy's death was announced by White House Acting Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff at 1:33 p.m. Press Secretary Pierre Salinger was traveling to Japan that day along with much of the cabinet. Governor Connolly, meanwhile, underwent surgery. Members of Kennedy's security detail were attempting to remove Kennedy's body from the hospital when they briefly scuffled with Dallas officials, including Dallas County Coroner Earl Rose, who believed that he was legally obligated to perform an autopsy before Kennedy's body was moved. The Secret Service pushed through, and Rose eventually stepped aside. The forensic panel of the HSCA, of which Rose was a member, well, that's no conflict of interest there, later said that Texas law made it the responsibility of the Justice of the Peace to determine cause of death and to determine whether an autopsy was needed. A Dallas County Justice of the Peace signed the official record of inquest as well as a second certificate of death. A few minutes after 2 p.m., Kennedy's body was taken from Parkland Hospital to Love Field. His casket was loaded into the rear of the passenger compartment of Air Force One in place of a removed row of seats. Vice President Lyndon Johnson had accompanied Kennedy to Dallas and been riding 2 cars behind Kennedy's limousine in the motorcade. He became president as soon as Kennedy died, and at 2:38 p.m., with Jacqueline Kennedy at his side, he was administered the oath of office by federal judge Sarah Tillman Hughes aboard Air Force One shortly before departing for Washington. Autopsy. Kennedy's body was flown back to Washington, D.C. His autopsy was performed at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland, between about 8 p.m. and midnight, Saturday, November 23rd. It was performed at a naval hospital at the request of Jacqueline Kennedy on the basis that President Kennedy had been a naval officer during World War II. And again, we'll be getting into all of the autopsy issues, of which there are no shortage of. Funeral. On Sunday, November 24th, Kennedy's coffin was carried on a horse-drawn caisson to the United States Capitol to lie in state. Throughout the day and night, hundreds of thousands of people lined up to view the guarded casket. Representatives from over 90 countries attended the state funeral on Monday, November 25th. After the Requiem Mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral, Kennedy was buried at Arlington National Cemetery just outside of Washington in Virginia. Film and audio captures of assassination events. No radio or television stations broadcast the assassination live. Most media crews did not ride with the motorcade, but were instead waiting at Dallas Trade Mart in anticipation of Kennedy's arrival there. Members of the media who were with the motorcade were riding at the rear of the procession. The Dallas police were recording their radio transmissions over 2 different channels. Channel 1 was used for routine police communications, while Channel 2 was dedicated to the motorcade. Until shots were fired, most traffic on the second channel was Police Chief Jesse Curry's updates on the motorcade's location. Kennedy's last seconds of traveling through Dealey Plaza were recorded on silent 8mm film for the 26.6 seconds before, during, and immediately following the assassination. This famous film footage was taken by garment manufacturer and amateur cameraman Abraham Zapruder and became known as the Zapruder film. Frame enlargements from the Zapruder film were published by Life magazine shortly after the assassination. The footage was first shown publicly as a film at the trial of Clay Shaw in 1969 and on television in 1975, so quite some time after it was taken. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, in 1999, an arbitration panel ordered the U.S. government to pay $615,384 per second of film to Zapruder's heirs for giving the film to the National Archives. That's a very specific amount. That's per second of film. The complete film, which lasts for roughly over 26 seconds, was valued at $16 million. Including Zapruder, 32 photographers are known to have been in Dealey Plaza that day. Amateur movies taken by Orville Nix, Marie Muchmore, shown on television in New York on November 26, 1963, and photographer Charles Bronson. Okay, that's an interesting name. Captured the fatal shot, though at a greater distance than Zapruder did. Other motion picture films were taken in Dealey Plaza at or around the time of the shooting by Robert Hughes, F. Mark Bell, Elsie Dorman, John Martin Jr., Patsy Paschal, Tina Towner, James Underwood, Dave Weigman, Mal Couch, Thomas Adkins, and an unknown woman in a blue dress on the south side of Elm Street. It's kind of mind-boggling, mind-shocking that in a major city, near a presidential motorcade, there's still unidentified individuals. Like, nobody knows who these individuals are. It's kind of weird, kind of bizarre, but that is quite a lot of film. It stated these were other motion picture films. That's a lot of people with motion picture cameras in the I mean, this is crazy. In the early 60s. I mean, today, there's even events today where people don't have their cell phones. I mean, obviously, most major events they would have plenty of footage, but even in like whatever, the 80s and 90s, there's so many events where there's no footage. And here you have all these individuals taking motion picture films. Still photos were taken by Philip Willis, Mary Mormon, Hugh W. Betzner Jr., Wilma Bond, Robert Croft, and many others. Ike Altkins, a photo editor for the Associated Press in Dallas, was the only professional photographer in Dealey Plaza who was not in the press cars. Motion pictures and photographs taken by some of these people show an unidentified woman, nicknamed by researchers as the Babushka Lady, apparently filming the motorcade at around the time of the assassination. And it's just crazy how she's still unidentified. And I'll actually be doing a dedicated episode on this Babushka Lady. And what's curious is so she's never been identified, and the film that she was filming has never been identified. Isn't that curious? But just real quick from the Wikipedia, Babushka Lady is an unknown woman present during the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy, who might have photographed the events that occurred in Dallas's Dealey Plaza at the time President John F. Kennedy was shot. Her nickname arose from the headscarf she wore, which was similar to scarves worn by elderly Russian women. Babushka literally means grandmother or old woman in Russian. The Babushka Lady was seen to be holding a camera by eyewitnesses and was also seen in film accounts of the assassination. She was observed standing on the grass between Elm and Main Streets and is visible in the Zapruder film as well as in the films of Orville Nix, Mary Mushmore, and Mark Bell. 44 minutes and 47 seconds into the Bell film, even though the shooting had already taken place and most of her surrounding witnesses to cover, she can be seen still standing with the camera at her face, which is curious because it's almost like did she have some insider knowledge and she knew it was safe after that fact? Because everybody else is running or ducking for cover or already undercover, but she's just standing there with the camera at her face. Is that curious? After the shooting, she crossed Elm Street and joined the crowd that went up the grassy knoll. She is last seen in photographs walking east on Elm Street. Neither she nor the film she may have taken have ever been positively identified. Beverly Oliver's claim. In 1970, a woman named Beverly Oliver told conspiracy researcher Gary Shaw at a church revival meeting in Joshua, Texas, that she was the Babushka Lady. Oliver stated that she filmed the assassination with a Super 8 film Yashica, and that she turned the undeveloped film over to two men who identified themselves to her as FBI agents. According to Oliver, she obtained no receipt from the men who told her that they would return the film to her within 10 days. She did not follow up with an inquiry. She reiterated her claims in the 1988 documentary The Men Who Killed Kennedy. According to Vincent Bugliosi, Oliver has never proved to most people's satisfaction that she was in Dealey Plaza that day. Confronted with the fact that the Yashica Super 8 camera was not made until 1969, she stated that she received the experimental camera from a friend and was not even sure the manufacturer's name was on it. Wow. That is curious, but here's the thing, though. In a certain... I've known people who have received prototypes and have actually utilized them of various kinds of technology. So it's not that that's an impossibility. Now, does she have a connection to this friend? Was this friend identified? Does this friend work for Yashica or in the film camera industry, in film camera manufacturing? Because if they do and they can be identified and they can corroborate her claim, this can be verified. But was it even attempted to be verified? Beverly Oliver's claims were the basis for a scene in Oliver Stone's 1991 film JFK in which a character named Beverly meets Jim Garrison in a Dallas nightclub. Played by Lolita Davidovich, she is depicted in the director's cut as wearing a headscarf at Dealey Plaza and speaking of having given the film she shot to two men claiming to be FBI agents. The House Select Committee on Assassinations report in March 1979. The Photographic Evidence Panel of the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations indicated that they were unable to locate any film attributed to the Babushka lady. Because if she's the closest, and if she clearly filmed other shooters, I mean, it's kind of curious. They would make that film disappear, wouldn't they? According to their report, initially Robert Groden, a photographic consultant to the committee, advised the panel as to pertinent photographic issues and related materials. Committee investigators located many of the suggested films and photographers. However, some items were never located, i.e. the Babushka Lady film, a color photograph by Norman Silamus, and the original negative of the Betzner photograph. All quite curious. Public hearings of the Assassination Records Review Board. On November 18, 1994, assassination researcher Gary Mack testified before the Assassination Records Review Board that he had recently been told by an executive in Kodak's Dallas office that a woman in her early 30s with brunette hair brought in film purported to be of the assassination scene while they were processing the Zapruder film. According to Mack, the executive said the woman explained to federal investigators already at the film processing office that she ran from Main Street across the grass to Elm Street, where she stopped and snapped a photo with some people in the foreground of the presidential limousine and the Texas School Book Depository. Mack said that she was told by the Kodak executive that the photo was extremely blurry and virtually useless, and indicated that the woman likely went home without anyone recording her identity. After suggesting that the woman in the story may have been the Babushka lady, Mack then told the board, "I do not believe that Beverly Oliver is the Babushka lady, or let me rephrase, that she certainly could be, but the rest of her story is a fabrication." That's weird. So he's saying she could have been there, she could have filmed it, but the FBI did not confiscate it. But how would he know that? Because if the agents purporting to be the FBI weren't actually the FBI, how would he know it was a fabrication? Unless he knows it's not, and he said he was. Also appearing that same day before the ARRB as Beverly Oliver Masaji, Oliver stated that she was 17 years old at the time of the assassination. She told the board that she was filming with an experimental 8mm movie camera approximately to 20-30 feet from Kennedy when he was shot, and that the film was confiscated by a man who identified himself as an FBI agent. According to Oliver, she handed over the camera because the man was an authority figure and because she feared being caught in possession of marijuana. Okay. So apparently she stated she was 17 years old and she had marijuana on her person. And that's why she handed over the... Also, even if she didn't have marijuana on her, she's 17, you have FBI approach you. I mean, how many people would hand it over, especially in the early 60s? Quite curious. A couple other curiosities with Beverly Oliver is that supposedly she's this really, really skinny dancer and singer at a burlesque club. And the woman known as Babushka lady, I mean, I don't know, it's kind of hard to tell exact body type. It's all blurry, but who knows? But she also claimed to know Jack Ruby, which is curious. She claimed she knew Jack Ruby, who introduced her to Lee Harvey Oswald, saying that Oswald was a member of the CIA. So that's all very, very curious. And the fact that she's wearing a Russian headscarf, I mean, how many other people are wearing Russian headscarves there? I mean, it's all quite bizarre. Now, before we finish up with, actually, we might as well dive a little deeper into Beverly Oliver since we're already rolling on her. But again, from mcadams.posc.mu.edu, it states that she was a dancer and singer at the Colony Club, Now, the Colony Club was a strip club, but apparently she was just a regular dancer and singer and not one of the strippers at the strip club. But this strip club competed directly with Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. She claims to have spent considerable time in the Carousel Club and to have known Jack Ruby as well. Over the years, her story has been elaborated to include many elements which, if true, would imply a conspiracy to murder Kennedy. How credible are her claims? So let's look at her claims here. But before we get into that, before we get into her claims, I mean, just some other possibilities here. If we're dealing with some MK Ultra mind control type witnesses here, or subjects, possibly including Leah Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, and the Babushka lady, is it possible something happened and her memory came back? She was unaware of what she was there for, and she went public, and this is why so much information is conflicting. Is she possibly... So if you look again in these photographs, she has a relatively wide stance, which if you look at the other women in the photographs, their stance is not wider than her shoulders. Her stance appears to be wider than her shoulders, especially if she's really slender under that coat. So apparently the weather report was that it would be raining earlier in the morning, but then it changed and it was sunny. But either way, if she's that slender... But look, some people believe it's a man dressed as a woman, and they're holding binoculars and not a camera. So it's interesting. It's very, very interesting because her stance is quite wider than the shoulders, or if that's a man, and that's... And if she's holding binoculars, that means she never actually did film anything. But was she there? Was she a Russian agent making sure the assassination went down as planned? It's all quite curious. There's so many different possibilities. Some people even believe that she's some kind of time traveler there to witness, that she's not Beverly Oliver, but the Babushka lady is some kind of time traveler that wanted a first-hand look at the assassination. But either way, let's look at the claims here. She claimed to be in Dealey Plaza during the assassination. No witnesses can corroborate Beverly Oliver's claim that she was at Dealey Plaza. The Babushka lady in Dealey Plaza appears in several photos and is older and stockier than Oliver was in 1963. Before presidential limo turned from Maine to Houston, she took up a position near a man and his young son on the south side of Elm Street, a reference to Charles Brem and his son Joe, who are seen near the Babushka lady at the time of the shooting. Brem and his son were not in this location, but rather at the corner of Maine and Houston, and ran across the grass after the limo turned onto Houston. Okay, claim filming Kennedy with a brand new Yashica Super 8 zoom movie camera. No such camera existed until 1965. And again, if she is some kind of an operative or a sleeper agent, obviously she would have access to technology that was not consumer or commercially available. After years of claiming to have used Super 8 zoom movie camera, backed off the story and denied to the Assassination Records Review Board that she had ever said that. But she did say that in the 1988 documentary, The Men Who Killed Kennedy. She claimed she saw Kennedy's head explode. It was like a bucket of blood thrown out the back of the limo. And this is consistent with the conspiracy book claims that the back of Kennedy's head was blown out, but flatly contradicted by movies of the head wound and by all other Dealey Plaza witnesses. When she returned to work on Monday evening, over 72 hours after the assassination, FBI men were waiting on the landing of the Colony Club and confiscated her film. So the evaluation here, again, this is from the heavily biased mcadams.posc.mu.edu website on the Kennedy assassination. It's an authority-worshipping propaganda site. That doesn't mean there's not valuable information here, but just there's very, very biased here to authority worship. Vastly implausible that conspirators would allow her to keep the film for 3 days, risking her releasing it to the press or investigators not part of a cover-up. And here's where just the Dunning-Kruger goofiness of this website comes through, because why are they assuming they got her identity? If she just left, how would they know who she was immediately? if, if there were rumors, this, that, eventually they could have found out. 72 hours is pretty good to find out who somebody is, if her story is true. But it's just, again, you can see the slant, the coincidence theory, government worshipping slant here. Vastly implausible. It's very plausible if they didn't know who she was. Why would they immediately know who she was? They had to track her down. Again, I'm not saying this is her in any way. It seems like it's not, just from the photographs and from her alleged stature. Okay. She identified FBI agent who took her film as Regis Kennedy. That's interesting. So she knew, how would she know who the FBI agent was? So does that mean he showed her an ID that said Regis Kennedy? Anyway, Kennedy was in New Orleans on Monday, November 25th, and was interviewing Dean Andrews in the evening. So again, if it was not Regis Kennedy, but someone who had the ID of Regis Kennedy and possibly looked like him, okay, I guess. Or if she didn't know why would she know who the real Regis Kennedy looked like? So if it was someone with Regis Kennedy's ID, again, we don't know. We weren't there. Okay, she claimed to the House Select Committee that one of the men who took her film identified himself as a CIA agent. So she's flip-flopping from FBI to CIA. Absurd that any CIA agent in Dallas in the wake of an assassination would identify himself as CIA to someone like Oliver. Oliver dropped this element from later versions of her story. Why is it absurd? I mean, if the CIA is conducting some kind of investigation into some kind of foreign threat, or the FBI, we don't know what the situation is. Or, of course, a government agent from a different agency could identify themselves as CIA. How is that absurd? They don't know. If there is a cover-up, there, of course, could be it's very plausible that they wouldn't want to be tracked to their real agency if they're doing some kind of top-secret operation. 2 weeks before the assassination in the Carousel Club, Ruby introduced Oswald to her as my friend Lee Oswald of the CIA. And the evaluation here, of course, deep cover spooks go around telling people they are with the CIA. If they want to impress someone, I'm sure they do. I mean, there's countless stories of real CIA agents doing that, either while drunk or to impress people. And then, of course, other agents who are not really from the CIA saying they are from the CIA. But either way, if it was some kind of a joke, how would Beverly Oliver know whether someone was really from the CIA or not? So again, the goofiness of this McAdams website into assuming that Beverly Oliver, if somebody's talking to a 17-year-old dancer and they're trying to impress her, they might say they're with the CIA. How would she know any different? Again, it's weird. Dancer Janet Conforto witnessed Ruby's introduction of Oswald to Oliver and told newspaper reporters about it. That's interesting. So someone witnessed the introduction. So supposedly, when asked by Eddie Barker on KRLD radio on the evening of November 24th, she explicitly denied that she had seen Oswald in the Carousel Club. And if she was visited by agents to do so to discredit Oliver, of course she would deny it. Again, this isn't rocket science. So she claimed to have talked to Jada at the Carousel Club where she was performing on the eve of the assassination. And Jada had not worked at the Carousel Club since October 31st and was not there on November 21st. And again, this is this website taking it on blind faith that these reports are true. I don't know how they would have verified that. Okay, Oliver saw David Ferry around the Carousel Club so often that she assumed he must be an assistant manager, and none of the many Carousel Club employees corroborates this. Given Ferry's bizarre appearance, it seems certain they could have been there. Ferry lived in New Orleans and could hardly commute to Dallas. Oliver had dinner with Jack Ruby on the eve of the assassination, and he gave her a polka dot dress. That's an interesting detail. Ruby had dinner with friends on the eve of the assassination, and none of them mentioned Oliver in sworn testimony. Now, would they mention random dancers? I don't know. And then if Beverly Oliver was embellishing, like if she sat with them for 2 seconds and then walked away, why would they cite her as having dinner with them? So again, that doesn't really prove or disprove anything. Jack Ruby frequently expressed his hatred of JFK, and this is flatly contradicted by several witnesses who knew Ruby. Seems to be the result of Oliver's assumption that Ruby was a mobster and mobsters hated JFK. Very possible. And again, so the witnesses who knew Ruby, again, how many were interviewed? So if Ruby only expressed his hatred of JFK to certain individuals, I mean, humans are humans. I mean, a lot of people are very conscious of what they say around certain people. So it's just, again, this website is so biased. It's contradicted by several witnesses who knew Ruby. So it's very possible that Ruby never talked about his hatred for JFK with those witnesses, or he just made it up. I mean, again, this is just basic human psychology. People even say stuff they don't believe to either impress people or in certain crowds. Again, none of this proves anything in either direction. She claims to have seen Raoul, a shadowy figure supposedly part of a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King at the Carousel Club. Okay. And no evidence that Raoul ever existed. Well, wouldn't that make him an excellent conspiracist if nobody even knew he existed? He appears to have been invented by James Earl Ray, King's killer or alleged killer. Again, there's a lot of issues with the Martin Luther King assassination, which was also requested. I'll have to do that at a later date as well. She implied that Jada, supposed witness to Oswald and the Carousel Club, died in a mysterious way. And Janet Conforto died in a motorcycle accident. Now, again, how many times are government conspiracies covered up in routine vehicle accidents? I mean, that's kind of the go-to, right? Staged accidents. I mean, again, this website is so silly. Claimed that an English researcher had obtained frames from her film, which vindicated her story. That is very interesting. So she claimed this at a 1999 JFK Lancer conference. She took to the podium, announced to the crowd that her film had been found. She said she was provided with 4 frames of the film to prove its authenticity. Of course, a hand screamed into the air. The question began, can we see the picture? She said no, with great definiteness. She said she could not show the pictures as part of the deal to obtain the film. I was seated towards the front of the conference room the next morning. The conference had already started when Oliver came in. I was not surprised when she chose to sit at the table and chair opposite mine. She shuffled papers from her bag onto the table. She held four photos close to her chest like a poker player with the winning hand. She ever so carefully laid the photos face down on the table. As she shuffled the paper around, one of the photos fell off the table and landed face up on the floor. Of course, I looked. Very quickly, she scooped up the photo and returned it to the pile. After Oliver was done shuffling the papers and photos, she mentioned for me to come close. I knew I was about to see a photo. I was excited. I leaned over to her and she said, pull your chair close. I did. She said that she was going to show me the headshot from this newly discovered film. She did. She also quickly showed me the other 3. I was stunned. They were the headshot from the Knicks film. I immediately recognized the frames. She said, it must be my film because I ain't in the frames. I talked to Oliver during that break. I said the film was taken from a point too far to the west to be the Babushka film. She said I was running as I filmed, and you can see that in the Zapruder film. I was stunned again, but not speechless. I thought she might be talking about panning the camera to follow the limo and had chosen her words poorly. Oh, you mean you were panning along with the limo? She said, no, I was running as I filmed, and you can see it in the Zapruder film. Okay. So what does this all mean? So does this mean she's easily tricked? Because again, she was 17 at the time. Again, we don't know her current intelligence level. If she was told this was the Babushka film and she really believed it, is she making a false claim? Particularly if she was involved with some kind of MK Ultra program, or even if she's not. I don't know if anybody flat out asked her if she was involved in drugs in any way, but is her memory not perfect from that from that day when she was 17? Was she impaired in some way? Again, this doesn't necessarily mean she's deceptive, or she could be completely insane and believing everything she's saying, and she's not the Babushka lady. And if her memory's not perfect, if she's more in the Maxwell realm of memories, maybe she did make conflicting statements. A lot of people do. Again, that doesn't really prove one way or the other. But let's get back to the rundown here. Previously unknown color footage filmed on Assassination Day by George Jeffreys was released in February 2007. How shocking was that? The film was shot over 90 seconds before the assassination several blocks away. However, it gives a clear view of Kennedy's bunched suit jacket just below the collar, which has led to varying calculations of how low in the back Kennedy was first shot. And so there's unknown color footage being released almost 50 years later. How crazy is that? And again, that just goes to show how much could be unknown or uncorroborated. So the official investigations, the Dallas police, after Dallas police arrested Oswald and collected physical evidence at the crime scenes, they held Oswald at their headquarters, questioned him all afternoon about the shootings of Kennedy and Tippit. They intermittently questioned him for approximately 12 hours between 2:30 on November 22nd and 2:30 p.m. on November 22nd and 11 a.m. on November 24th. Throughout, Oswald denied any involvement with either shooting. Captain Fritz of the Homicide and Robbery Bureau did most of the questioning. He kept only rudimentary notes. That's kind of weird. You're not keeping extensive notes on a presidential assassination. Days later, he wrote a report of the interrogation from notes he made afterwards. There were no stenograph or tape recordings. Why not? Representatives of other law enforcement agencies were also present, including the FBI and the Secret Service, and occasionally participated in the questioning. Some of the FBI agents who were present wrote contemporaneous reports of the interrogation. It's curious, was there no record of it? Because the FBI, Secret Service, CIA, whoever was in charge of this, they didn't want them to be? On the evening of the assassination, Dallas police confirmed paraffin tests on Oswald's hands and right cheek in an effort to establish whether or not he had recently fired a weapon. The results were positive for the hands and negative for the right cheek. Such tests were unreliable, and the Warren Commission did not rely on these results. Oswald provided little information during his questioning. When confronted with evidence that he could not explain, he resorted to statements that were found to be false. And exactly how they were found to be false is also curious, because again, if there is this widespread conspiracy, they're going to be found to be whatever they need to be found. The FBI investigation on December 9th, 1963, the Warren Commission received the FBI's report of its investigation, which concluded that 3 bullets had been fired, the first hitting Kennedy, the second hitting Connally, the third hitting Kennedy in the head, killing him. The Warren Commission concluded that one of the 3 shots missed. So yeah, it was the FBI's report. The Warren Commission, so that was the FBI's report. First hits Kennedy, second hits Connally, third hits Kennedy. The Warren Commission concluded that one of the 3 shots missed, one passed through Kennedy, and then struck Connally, and a third struck Kennedy. So the Warren Commission, the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, known unofficially as the Warren Commission, was established on November 29th, 1963 by President Johnson to investigate the assassination. And of course, if the theory is that Johnson had him assassinated, of course he would commission certain findings for his own commission to find. It's the accused investigating themselves and finding themselves innocent. Its 888-page final report was presented to Johnson on September 24, 1964, and made public 3 days later. It concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in killing Kennedy and wounding Connally, and that Jack Ruby acted alone in killing Oswald. The Commission's findings have been proven controversial and have been variously criticized and supported by later studies. The Commission took its unofficial name, the Warren Commission, from its chairman, Chief Justice Earl Warren. According to published transcripts of Johnson's presidential phone conversations, some major officials were opposed to forming such a commission, and several commission members took part only with extreme reluctance. Is that because they knew the fix was in, and they maybe had some kind of modicum of integrity and they didn't want their name on it? One of their chief reservations was that a commission would ultimately create more controversy than consensus, and those fears ultimately proved valid. Unless, of course, if the commission was really legitimate, though, and actually backed up all its claims. Okay, all of the Warren Commission's records were submitted to the National Archives in 1964. The unpublished portion of those records was initially sealed for 75 years to 2039 under a general National Archives policy that applied to all federal investigations by the executive branch of government. A period, quote, intended to serve as protection for innocent persons who could otherwise be damaged because of their relationship with participants in the case, end quote. The 75-year rule no longer exists, supplanted by the Freedom of Information Act of 1966 and the JFK Records Act of 1992. Okay, the Ramsey-Clark panel. In 1968, a panel of 4 medical experts appointed by Attorney General Ramsey Clark met to examine photographs, x-rays, documents, and other evidence. The panel concluded that Kennedy was struck by 2 bullets fired from above and behind, one traversing the base of the neck on the right without striking bone, and the other entering the skull from behind and destroying its upper right side. They also concluded that the skull shot entered well above the external occipital protuberance, which was at odds with the Warren Commission's findings. The Rockefeller Commission, I'm sure that one was unbiased. The United States President Commission on CIA Activities within the U.S. was set up under President Gerald Ford in 1975 to investigate the activities of the CIA within the United States. The commission was led by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller and is sometimes referred to as the Rockefeller Commission. Part of the commission's work dealt with the Kennedy assassination, specifically the head snap as seen in the Zapruder film, first shown to the general public that same year, 1975, and the possible presence of E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis in Dallas. The commission concluded that neither Hunt nor Sturgis was in Dallas at the time of the assassination. Church Committee. The Church Committee is the common term referring to the 1975 U.S. Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, a U.S. Senate committee chaired by Senator Frank Church to investigate the illegal intelligence gathering by the CIA and the FBI after the Watergate incident. And Watergate has also been requested on MINDSHOCK. I'll have to do one on that as well. I mean, there's so many mind-shocking aspects of all of these conspiracies and cover-ups that are just not talked about in the mainstream that do need to be examined, because some of them contain the most damning evidence. It also investigated the CIA and FBI conduct relating to the JFK assassination. Their report concluded that the investigation into the assassination by FBI and CIA was fundamentally deficient, and that facts that may have greatly affected the investigation had not been forwarded to the Warren Commission by the agencies. The report hinted that there was a possibility that senior officials in both agencies made conscious decisions not to disclose potentially important information. So what does that tell us? What does the Church Committee tell us? It tells us that even if the Warren Commission was operating in good faith and attempting to be objective, they still could not find the real truth because information was not given to them to do so by the FBI and the CIA that withheld important information. And that's something the coincidence theorists also failed to realize. If the people in charge, if there was a conspiracy, again, I'm not saying there was, but if there was and the FBI and or CIA were involved, why would they forward evidence that would expose them and the conspiracy to any objective committee actually out there for the truth, operating with integrity? I mean, the silliness. I mean, how much of a Dunning-Kruger coincidence theorist goof do you have to be to not understand that basic concept? Why would the conspiratorial parties responsible provide evidence against themselves? The U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations. As a result of increasing public and congressional skepticism regarding the Warren Commission's findings and the transparency of government agencies, House Resolution 1540 was passed in September 1976, creating the U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, to investigate the assassinations of Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. The committee investigated until 1978 and in March 1979 issued its final report concluding that President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. And that is quite shocking that a government agency, I mean, again, this committee was specifically designed to in respect to to government agency transparency. So is this the bone? Is this throwing the bone to the masses to make them look more legitimate instead of the status quo answers? There was no conspiracy. I mean, it is quite curious, and it's an anomaly. Normally, this does not happen in government, so it's worthy of examination. And because they use the word conspiracy itself, which, I mean, that is taboo. I mean, they always use scandal or scandal plot. They use anything and everything except conspiracy, because that's part of the whole brainwashing indoctrination to shut down critical thinking on the idiot box by the government and the establishment. The chief reason for this conclusion was, according to the report's dissent, the subsequently discredited acoustic analysis of a police channel dictabelt recording. The committee concluded that previous investigations into Oswald's responsibility were thorough and reliable, but they did not adequately investigate the possibility of a conspiracy, what a shocker, and that federal agencies performed with, quote, varying degrees of competency, end quote. And that's a true shocker there. That this U.S. House Select Committee on Assassinations is actually exposing at least the possibility of a lack of competency. You usually don't see that. Specifically, the FBI and CIA were found to be deficient in sharing information with other agencies and the Warren Commission. Instead of furnishing all information relevant to the investigation, the FBI and CIA only responded to specific requests and were still occasionally inadequate. Furthermore, the Secret Service did not properly analyze information it possessed prior to the assassination and was inadequately prepared to protect Kennedy. Wow, this kind of admission is so rare in government. Authority-worshipping cultists and those part of the scientism and statism establishments, I mean, they just do not usually admit this stuff. I mean, this is truly mind-shocking. Concerning the conclusions of probable conspiracy, 4 of the 12 committee members wrote dissenting opinions. In accordance with the recommendations of the HSCA, the dictabelt recording and acoustic evidence of a second assassin was subsequently re-examined. In light of investigative reports from the FBI's Technical Services Division and a specially appointed National Academy of Sciences Committee, determining that reliable acoustic data do not support a conclusion that there was a second gunman. And is that what they would conclude, especially the FBI Technical Services Division? Because a report that makes them look bad questions their competency, and I mean, saying it's all obviously they would want to shut this down quickly. So we need more objective, because even the National Academy of Sciences is dubious because officially it's a non-governmental organization. But again, if you look at the history of it and the connections to the establishment, I don't know if you could truly call that objective. You would probably need a non-U.S. committee. The Justice Department concluded that, quote, that no persuasive evidence can be identified to support the theory of a conspiracy, end quote, in the Kennedy assassination. Again, as you would expect. Although the final report and supporting volumes of the HSCA was publicly released, the working papers and primary documents were sealed until 2029 under congressional rules and only partially released as part of the 1992 JFK Act. Curious indeed. Okay, the JFK Act and Assassinations Records Review Board. In 1992, the popular but controversial movie JFK renewed public interest in the assassination and particularly in the still classified documents referenced in the film's postscript. Largely in response to the film, Congress passed the JFK Act, or President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. The goal of the legislation was to collect at the National Archives and make publicly available all of the assassination-related records held by federal and state government agencies, private citizens, and various other organizations. The JFK Act also mandated the creation of an independent office. I mean, how many offices are truly independent? The Assassination Records Review Board, to review the submitted records for completeness and continued secrecy. The review board was not commissioned to make any findings or conclusions regarding the assassination, just to collect and release all related documents. From 94 until 98, the Assassinations Records Review Board gathered and unsealed about 60,000 documents consisting of over 4 million pages. I mean, even nerds in their mom's basements might not be that committed to the JFK conspiracy to go through 4 million pages. I don't know, maybe some of them are. Government agencies requested that some records remain classified, and these were reviewed under Section 6 criteria of the JFK Act. There were 29,420 such records, and all of them were fully or partially released with stringent requirements for redaction. A staff report for the Assassination Records Review Board contended that brain photographs in the Kennedy records are not of Kennedy's brain and show much less damage than Kennedy sustained. Boswell refuted these allegations. The board also found that, conflicting with the photographic images showing no such defect, a number of witnesses at both the hospital and autopsy saw a large wound in the back of Kennedy's head. The board and board member Jeremy Gunn, it's a curious name, have also stressed the problems with witness testimony, asking people to weigh all of the evidence with due concern for human error rather than take single statements as proof for one theory or another, especially statements coming from government. All remaining assassination-related records, approximately 5,000 pages, were scheduled to be released by October 26, 2017, with the exception of documents certified for continued postponement by succeeding presidents under the following conditions. 1, continued postponement is made necessary by an identifiable harm to the military, defense, intelligence operations, law enforcement, or conduct of foreign relations. And 2, the identifiable harm is of such gravity that it outweighs the public interest in disclosure, end quote. Now that's curious, because if there's definitive evidence that, let's say, the CIA killed JFK, that would certainly cause some unrest. So basically, any evidence pointing to a conspiracy under those conditions, they could basically seal all of the truly smoking gun evidence. There was some concern among researchers that significant records, particularly those of the CIA, might still remain classified after 2017. Although these documents may include interesting historical information, all of the records were examined by the review board and were not determined to impact the facts of the Kennedy assassination. And again, I guess everybody just has to take the word for it. The guards are guarding themselves. President Donald Trump said in October 2017 that he would not block the release of documents. On April 26, 2018, the deadline set by President Trump to release all JFK records, he blocked the release of some records until October 26, 2021. So, again, why? Who knows? But we'll see what's released October 26th this year, and if it contains even more damning evidence. But as JR previously said on previous podcasts, and whether or not he's just a janitor for the Park Service or he really is some kind of secret government agent, what he said does make sense. Anything that's truly threatening to an entire generation, it's not really going to be released until 1 or 2 or 3 full generations later, where it's not going to do that much damage. Because are people going to care that much X amount of decades later or a century later, when the people that were around are no longer around to care as much? So continuing the rundown here, conspiracy theories. Many conspiracy theories posit that the assassination involved people or organizations in addition to Lee Harvey Oswald. Most current theories put forth a criminal conspiracy involving parties as varied as the FBI, the CIA, and the U.S. military, the Mafia, Vice President Johnson, Cuban President Fidel Castro, the KGB, or some combination of those entities. No surprise that the Wikipedia does not state the George Bush conspiracies. Public opinion polls have consistently shown that the majority of Americans believe there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy. Gallup polls have found that only 20 to 30% of the population believe that Oswald had acted alone. And the other curious thing, again, on MindShock, where we're objective and neutral, why believe either way? It's weird. If you don't have definitive evidence either way, why even take a position? These polls also show that there is no agreement on who else may have been involved. Former LA District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi is estimated that a total of 42 groups, 82 assassins, and 214 people had been accused in various Kennedy assassinations and conspiracy theories. Quite curious. All right, the last thing we're going to go over here is the information in the 2017 release of various JFK files. This is from mentalfloss.com. 5 intriguing details found in the newly released JFK assassination papers by Shaughnessy Farrow. JFK assassination conspiracy theorists just got a major windfall, but so did history buffs. In 1992, Congress passed a law that ordered all federal agencies to transfer any records they had pertaining to the investigation into the assassination of JFK to the National Archives. The vast majority of those records were declassified before this, but some were withheld or redacted. But the JFK Assassinations Records Collection Act stipulated that all records that had been withheld, either partially or in full, would be released to the public 25 years later on October 26, 2017. Well, the time has come to open up the files, and there is plenty of intriguing content in the 2,800 newly released documents to sift through. At the last minute, the government withheld 300 more documents, which will have to undergo classified review over the next 6 months. Here are 5 things we've learned so far, not all about the assassination itself, from the documents. 1. In the wake of the assassination, the FBI sought info from a strippers' union. As the Boston TV station WCVB spotted an FBI memo from January 1964 detailed the agency's search for a stripper connected to Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. The FBI was trying to determine the identity of the performer who went by the stage name Candy Cane. How original. But only knew that her first name was Kitty. That sounds like a real first name, isn't it? They went as far as to contact the American Guild of Variety Artists in New Orleans, who told them that one performer by that name had died several months before the JFK assassination, and the only other, whose real name was Vivian, had seemed to have left town sometime after paying her August union dues. The memo doesn't say how Ruby and Candy Cane were related or if they ever tracked her down. And again, if they did, would that ever be made public? And does this connect to Beverly Oliver and these other strip joints? So again, this is not some isolated claims. There's some overlap in some of these claims here. 2, the Soviets worried the whole thing was a coup. The USSR was no fan of the US, obviously, but the Soviets didn't cheer JFK's death. The news was greeted with shock and consternation, and church bells were tolled in memory of President Kennedy in the USSR, a Soviet source reported. Communist Party officials, for one, went on high alert, worrying that it was part of some far-right coup. They felt that those elements interested in utilizing the assassination and playing on anti-communist sentiments in the U.S. would then utilize this act to stop negotiations with the Soviet Union, attack Cuba, and therefore spread the war, the FBI memo from December 1966 states. And even if it wasn't part of a larger plan, they thought it could still lead to big trouble. Soviet officials were worried that without leadership, some irresponsible general in the U.S. might launch a missile at the Soviet Union. Plus, they were very much of the devil-you-know mindset. Soviet diplomats understood JFK and respected that he had, to some degree, a mutual understanding with the Soviet Union and a desire for peace between the two powers, and they had no idea what to expect from Vice President Lyndon Johnson. The Soviet Union would have preferred to have President Kennedy at the helm of the American government, the memo said, citing the USSR's UN representative Nikolai T. Fedorenko. 3. The Soviets called Oswald a neurotic maniac. In 1959, long before Kennedy's assassination, Oswald had traveled to the Soviet Union. Shortly after arriving, he contacted the KGB asking to defect. But the Soviet spy agency, quote, decided he was mentally unstable and informed him he had to return to the U.S. upon completion of his visit, end quote. He was hospitalized after cutting his wrists in his Moscow hotel room and was allowed to remain in Russia for some time afterward, even marrying a Russian woman. After he returned to the U.S., he sent a request to the Soviet embassy in Mexico just a few months before the assassination, asking to come back to the USSR. In the wake of the assassination, the USSR reiterated that it wanted nothing to do with Oswald and never recruited him for espionage. Soviet officials claimed that Lee Harvey Oswald had no connection whatsoever with the Soviet Union, the memo states. They described him as a neurotic maniac who was disloyal to his own country and never belonged to any organization. By those standards, the Soviet Union would never accept any defectors, right? Any kind of spies from the U.S., but obviously they did. So anyway, like here's the thing. If Oswald really was mentally unstable, but the Soviet Union did utilize him as an agent of some sort, of course they would deny it. What did they expect him to do? Oh yeah, by the way, Oswald really was one of our agents. I mean, what do coincidence theorists think? I mean, I know Dunning-Kruger is running rampant, but I mean, come on, even small children can understand. If Oswald really was a Soviet secret spy or some kind, obviously Soviet officials would claim that Lee Harvey Oswald has no connection to the Soviet. I mean, what are they going to do? Admit that he does? I mean, and start some kind of international incident and possibly a war? I mean, what is going on in the minds of coincidence theorists? Probably not much. 4, the Cuban government was kind of giddy. Perhaps unsurprisingly, what with all of those assassination plots, invasion attempts, and blockades, the Cubans were pretty stoked to see JFK go. The initial reaction of Cuban Ambassador Cruz and his staff to the report of assassination president was one of happy delight, a CIA source reported on November 27, 1963. However, the Cubans realized that undisguised glee wasn't going to be a good look for them. Cruz thereupon issued instructions to his staff and to Cuban consulates and trade offices in Toronto and Montreal to cease looking happy in public. Quote, that's a quote, cease looking happy in public, the memo states. Wow, that's crazy. 5, the CIA once tried to hire the mob to kill Fidel Castro. The CIA's foiled plots to kill the Soviet-aligned Cuban leader Fidel Castro are well known, but somewhat tangential to the assassination of JFK lies yet another misguided attempt to bump off Castro. In a top-secret report prepared during Gerald Ford's administration, the agency admits that it tried to recruit the mob to help. I mean, this is quite mind-shocking. In phase 1 of the assassination plot formed sometime in 1960 or 1961, the CIA plotted to make poison botulism pills, then get members of the mafia to deliver them to Cuba into the hands of someone who could drop them into Castro's drink. They tested out the pills on guinea pigs to make sure they worked and set aside the money to make it happen. In 1960, the CIA reached out to Chicago mobster Sam Giancana through an intermediate, and the agency approved a $150,000 payment for whatever contact in Cuba actually accomplished the task. So $150,000 of U.S. taxpayer money is being siphoned for a commissioned murder, for a mob hit. The mobsters didn't get any money, and they repeatedly said they didn't want any anyway. They were just looking to get back into the Havana gambling business. The asset assigned to slip the pills to Castro got scared, though, and didn't actually do it, even though he worked in the Cuban Prime Minister's office and had access. Then the CIA recruited a staffer at a restaurant Castro frequented, but by the time the pills arrived, Castro had stopped going there. Was that coincidental? The plot was called off after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and in 1967, J. Edgar Hoover sent the U.S. Attorney General a memo that referred to the plot as the CIA's intentions to send hoodlums to Cuba to assassinate Castro. Wow. Okay, so let's recoup for all the coincidence theorists out there that think that the CIA and the mob would never orchestrate hits or pay people off or engage in any kind of conspiracies. Obviously, there's direct evidence otherwise. There's tons of evidence that government agencies conspire with third party entities, possibly the mob, possibly other entities, to get their criminal business done. So conspiracy, again, the connotation of conspiracy theory with either untrue or crazy is, of course, orchestrated by the CIA itself, and it worked brilliantly through the indoctrination on the idiot box. There's a few other interesting tidbits in these newly released files. I'm going to go to nationalpost.com now by Michael E. Miller, April 6, 2018. Updated. New JFK files reveal secrets about sex parties, spies, and assassination plots. There was also $100,000 to kill Fidel Castro. A 1964 FBI memo describes a meeting in which Cuban exiles tried to set a price on the heads of Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and Ernesto Che Guevara. It was felt that the $150,000 to assassinate Fidel Castro plus $5,000 expense money was too high, the memo noted. At a subsequent meeting, they settled on more modest sums, $100K for Fidel, $20K for Raul, and $20K for Che. Wow. I wonder how the U.S. taxpayers feel about their taxes being used on hits to murder people. I mean, what if the taxpayers are Christians and they believe in the Ten Commandments and they don't want their extorted funds to be used to kill people? Or was Fidel only worth 2 cents? Another document describes the well-known CIA scheme called Operation Bounty that's set to overthrow Cuba's government and establish a system of financial rewards for Cubans for, quote, killing or delivering alive known communists, end quote. The CIA would let Cubans know of the plan by dropping leaflets in the air, but there were rules. A reward would be paid to an individual upon presentation of a leaflet with conclusive proof of death and dead person's party revolutionary membership card. Cubans who played along would get a certain dollar amount based on the title of the communist who they had killed. They'd get up to $100K for government officials, $57.5K for department heads, that's a very specific number. Castro, perhaps for symbolic reasons, would earn a Cuban only 2 cents. That's curious. I guess that was reserved for mobsters or other deals they had to kill Castro, so Cubans could only get 2 cents for killing Castro. Sex parties. A 1960 FBI memo described a high-priced Hollywood call girl who was approached by Fred Otash, a well-known LA private investigator seeking information about sex parties involving then-Senator John F. Kennedy, his brother-in-law, actor Peter Lawford, Frank Sinatra, and Sammy Davis Jr. She told the agents that she was unaware of any indiscretions, the memo said, and actually touched upon JFK and Lawford in the Marilyn Monroe podcast. If you haven't checked out the MINDSHOCK podcast on that, check that out. Lyndon B. Johnson in the KKK. In an internal FBI report from May 1964, an informant told the FBI that the Ku Klux Klan said, quote, it had documented proof that President Johnson was formerly a member of the Klan in Texas during the early days of his political career, end quote. The documented proof was not provided. So here's another CIA plot against Castro. Some of the papers recounted the agency's well-chronicled schemes to kill Castro. One document, a summary of the CIA's plans to assassinate foreign leaders, recounted how the CIA tried to use James B. Donovan, the American lawyer and negotiator recently made famous by the movie Bridge of Spies, for one plot. He would give Castro a contaminated skin diving suit while the two negotiated for the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners. It was known that Fidel Castro liked to skin dive. The CIA plan was to dust the inside of the suit with a fungus producing Madeira foot, a disabling and chronic skin disease, and also contaminating the suit with tuberculosis bacilli in the breathing apparatus. The paper said, Donovan didn't go through with it, instead presenting the Cuban leader with an uncontaminated skin diving suit as a gesture of friendship. And again, how do Americans feel about their tax dollars being used on biological warfare? Another outlandish plot described talks of prepping a booby-trap spectacular seashell that would be submerged in an area Castro enjoyed diving. See, this is what the CIA and government officials are sitting around doing, plotting these things. The seashell would be loaded with explosives that would go off once lifted. After investigation, it was determined that there was no shell in the Caribbean area large enough to hold a sufficient amount of explosives, which was spectacular enough to attract the attention of Castro. So they want to get a shiny seashell in the hopes that Castro would pick it up and it would have explosives. I mean, this is worse than a James Bond movie. Another scheme to kill Castro involved a CIA employee fluent in Spanish, based in Cuba, who was recruiting a high-ranking Cuban government official in 1963. The CIA officer and the Cuban actually met in Europe on the day of Kennedy's assassination. The Cuban wanted the CIA to supply him with some type of esoteric gadget with which he would be able to defend himself if he got into a fight with Castro. He had in mind some sort of pellet pen, the document read. The agency officer didn't have a pellet pen, but he did show his asset a ballpoint pen with a hypodermic needle. Inside that, when you pushed the lever, the needle came out and poison could be injected into someone. Is it still bizarre that coincidence theorists refuse to acknowledge that the CIA does plot to kill people with all these gadgets? And do they deny that they've ever done so, ever? I mean, it's kind of weird. But the Cuban declined the gadget because it would have required him to get too close to Castro. Instead, the agent asked the CIA operative for weapons. The agency complied, sending down high-powered rifles with scopes to Cuba. The asset was never used. The case officer broke off contact in 1964. Jack Ruby and Officer Tippit. An April 1964 memo from J. Edgar Hoover ordered the FBI to check out a report that Jack Ruby and Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, fatally shot by Oswald shortly after Oswald killed Kennedy, had met at Ruby's strip club, the Carousel Club, sometime prior to the assassination. Hoover seemed skeptical. Why would he seem skeptical if he doesn't know? Weird. Hollywood Blacklist. Many of the files reveal the FBI's often extraordinary efforts to identify suspected communists in the U.S., and of course, I actually went over all of this in the Britney Spears podcast on the CIA in Hollywood. If you want to check that out, you can check that out. So, what probably the most curious part of these documents, the records also reveal a deposition given before the Presidential Commission on CIA Activities in 1975 by Richard Helms, who had served as the agency's director. After a discussion of Vietnam, David Bellin, an attorney for the commission, turned to whether the CIA was involved in Kennedy's killing. Quote, "Well, now, the final area of my investigation relates to charges that the CIA was in some way conspiratorially involved with the assassination of President Kennedy. During the time of the Warren Commission, you were Deputy Director of Plans. Is that correct?" End quote, Bellin asked. After Helms replied that he was, Bellin then asked, quote, "Is there any information involved with the assassination of President Kennedy which in any way shows that Lee Harvey Oswald was in some way a CIA agent or agent ... Then suddenly the document cuts off. Now that's a curious place to end a document, is it not? And what do the coincidence theorists make of that? Because if Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA agent or asset, what does that mean? I'll be exploring even more of that in the next episode, but I'm going to close this out with JFK's speech on secret societies. So this speech, of course, has been shrouded in a lot of controversy, and it's almost been scrubbed from the internet to a point where it's kind of hard to find it. And this is, of course, the speech, the address, the president of the press. This was in front of the American Newspaper Publishers Association, April 27th, 1961. And this is the curious part of it, where JFK actually uses the word conspiracy and calls out what's going on with the Illuminati, New World Order, whatever you want to call it. It requires a change in outlook, a change in tactics. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts. I want to talk about our common responsibilities in the face of a common danger. The events of recent weeks may have helped to illuminate that challenge for some, but the dimensions of its threat have loomed large on the horizon for many years. Whatever our hopes may be for the future, for reducing this threat or living with it, there is no escaping either the gravity or the totality of its challenge to our survival and to our security. A challenge that confronts us in unaccustomed ways in every sphere of human activity. This deadly challenge imposes upon our society two requirements of direct concern both to the press and to the president. Two requirements that may seem almost contradictory in tone, but which must be reconciled and fulfilled if we are to meet this national peril. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second to the need for far greater official secrecy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. But I do ask every publisher, every editor, and every newsman in the nation to re-examine his own standards and to recognize the nature of our country's peril. In time of war, the government and the press have customarily joined in an effort based largely on self-discipline to prevent unauthorized disclosure to the enemy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have held that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. Today, no war has been declared, and however fierce the struggle may be, it may never be declared in the traditional fashion. Our way of life is under attack. Those who make themselves our enemy are advancing around the globe. The survival of our friends is in danger. And yet no war has been declared, no borders have been crossed by marching troops, no missiles have been fired. If the press is awaiting a declaration of war before it imposes the self-discipline of combat conditions, then I can only say that no war ever posed a greater threat to our security. If you are awaiting a finding of clear and present danger, then I can only say that the danger has never been more clear, and its presence has never been more imminent. It requires a change in outlook, a change in tactics, a change in missions by the government, by the people, by every businessman or labor leader, and by every newspaper. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. It conducts the Cold War, in short, with a wartime discipline no democracy would ever hope or wish to match. Nevertheless, every democracy recognized the necessary restraints of national security, and the question remains whether those restraints need to be more strictly observed if we are to oppose this kind of attack as well as outright invasion. So again, this speech, and if he could only see what was happening in 2020 or even 2001 and beyond, but either way, this speech, some believe, started JFK's road to assassination and exposing these secret societies and these forces working behind the scenes covertly. And again, there's plenty more issues with the Bushes and the CIA and all of this insanity surrounding the JFK assassination. And of course, there's plenty more to explore, and even more new evidence, confessions, and things that have not been publicized in other documentaries that we will be going over in the coming episodes. Hope you guys enjoyed another edition of the MindShock podcast in the JFK series. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal, help support the MindShock channel, help us get out more mind-shocking and logical coverage of conspiracies, true crime, and the paranormal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. If you like this podcast, hit that like button, share it across social media platforms, of which you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for a topic, logical analysis, co-podcaster requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.